Welcome back to the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. This series, After War, Before Peace, is a series that we began in November immediately after the cessation of hostilities, following 45 days of serious hostilities that resulted in Azerbaijan taking control of 7 territories around Karabakh and parts of Karabakh itself, and resulted in Russian peacekeepers coming to Karabakh and its perimeter to assure security, is what the title peacekeepers implies. During this process, the political process that has been going on has been unclear, not very transparent, and possibly sometimes just purely absent. Our effort here in this series is to separate each of the aspects of this post-war process, to try to understand it better, explain it, and to seek some sort of path towards security and peace. Our guest today in this endeavor, before the guest, our permanent host in this endeavor, my colleague Emil Sanamyan is also here. Emil, welcome back. Emil is a Caucasus analyst and the institutional memory that most of us go to for details on this 30 plus years of conflict and well, sometimes violent conflict, sometimes efforts at dialogue towards coexistence. So, Emil, welcome back. Our guest is Dr. Vicken Cheterian, who is a journalist, an author, a political scientist. He teaches at Webster University in Geneva, and he's the author of several books, including Open Wounds about Armenians, Turks, and a Century of Genocide. Also, War and Peace in the Caucasus, with an interesting subtitle, Russia's Troubled Frontier, and Little Wars in a Great Game, Local Conflicts and International Competition in the Caucasus. And these titles certainly encapsulate where we are today. Vicken, welcome.
Hello, Salpi. Hello, Emil. Nice to have you again.
Thank you for joining us. Vicken, you've been in a whole lot of conversations since the war, public conversations with Azerbaijanis, with international observers. And before this conversation, our conversation today ends, I really want to ask you what your takeaways are from those. You know, are they the classical post-conflict, dialogue, second track, and all of that, or is it something else, given how different the outcome of this conflict was? But before we go there, what we want to talk about today is political messaging. What the leaders involved in this conflict, and clearly there are 2 main leaders, the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, the President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev. There are also other leaders involved, the leader of Russia, the leader of Turkey, and Western leaders, but we'll get to that later. But what is the messaging that is on the ground? If we work on the premise that political leaders use messaging, and I don't mean speeches, obviously, but to try to use words, information, concepts that develop some sort of trust, some sort of expectation by the audience, whether it's their own constituency or, in this day of the internet, the world. If we work on that premise, I don't know that there is any messaging out there. Can we start with that? Is there political messaging being delivered by the leaders who have been charged with taking us from war to some sort of security and peace?
Yes, I think we can start observing different discourses emerging from Baku and from Yerevan. To start with Yerevan, for example, if you follow the executive in Armenia, the prime minister and his office, one has the feeling that the conflict is behind us, and the main concern of the Armenian executive, of the prime minister, is to go on with business as usual, what he was trying to do before the war, that is internal reforms. This might sound strange, but this is the messaging coming out of Nikol Pashinyan's office. At least this is my reading of it. This might be a bit strange because at the same time we know that the country is facing a very deep internal political crisis, and the message is that the answer to this crisis for the moment is suspended. There's a different messaging, a different discourse.
What is suspended?
Sorry?
You said the answer.
The attempt of the executive to answer to this question. Back in November and December, the idea was to organize elections. For the moment, we have a feeling that this idea is abandoned by the Prime Minister of Armenia, and we don't know what's their answer to the internal political crisis. We know the crisis is there. We know that there's a question of political legitimacy inside Armenia, but we don't know what is the answer of the Prime Minister to this challenge. Now, when we listen to different institutions in Yerevan, there are other messages coming. For example, if you follow the discourse emerging from the Armenian Foreign Ministry, it is a very different discourse. It's a defensive one. It's a one which points to Turkey's and Azerbaijanis violations of a number of issues, but it didn't move forward towards a more proactive diplomatic stage. So just these two institutions, you see that in Armenia there's some confusion and very defensive positioning. Now, if you follow the discourse emerging from Azerbaijan, for sure, initially it was one celebrating victory, and it was initially a backward-looking discourse. For example, when you read the speech of Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev during the victory parade in Baku, I think it was December 10 of last year, the whole speech was backward-looking. There was no single idea forward-looking. This might be the case because maybe the political elite in Baku, they were not ready for this victory. They were not ready to have alternative policies in case of any shift in Armenia-Azerbaijan relations. But in the last few days, there's a new discourse emerging. If you follow Azerbaijani media today, there were a couple of interviews that President Aliyev gave, where you find a very shy shift away from polarizing discourse, antagonizing discourse, towards talking about what comes in the future, that the conflict is over, and we should think about peace, and we should think about the future.
Using the word peace.
We are still in a very...
Using the word peace.
Yes, the word peace.
Because this might be the first time.
Peace was mentioned.
This might be the first time. Emil, have you heard him say peace?
I've heard them say peace in different contexts.
Yeah? During this post-45-day period?
Yes. I mean, it depends on the context. There has always been a sense that obviously Azerbaijani leader also wanted peace. It's just on a particular terms. And now that these terms have largely come about, it's normal, as Vicken points out, that he would shift that discourse towards less polarizing one.
So if we go back to Armenia for a moment, the fact that, as you said, Vicken, that the executive is generally saying, okay, where do we go from here? Does that mean that officially we are to understand that Armenia has accepted the outcome as it is on the ground? That is, you can accept a military loss, but still say, politically, the loss of the integrity of what used to be the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, the integrity of that region is still something that is important for both the security and peace of the region. You can mix the military and the political messages, but it isn't being done. Does that mean Armenia de facto accepts that this is the end of the road and this is where we're working now?
My reading is that the executive in Yerevan, so the prime minister and his cabinet, they of course they are politicians, and we know that we are not now on the 26th of September 2020. In between, many things happen, and there's a new reality on the ground. And my feeling is that their policy is to not to provoke the situation, not to polarize, but to invest heavily in supporting Karabakh Armenians, Karabakh Armenian de facto authority, and they are injecting, this is very evident, massive funds to support the return of Karabakh Armenians, to rebuild houses, to rebuild the infrastructure, and to ensure that the Armenian population of Karabakh will stay there, not just return, but also will return and will stay there. And to do that, we need to have a secure environment. And I think they are working on that. And I think in this project, they are working hand in hand with the Russian authorities and the Russian military, which ensures the security of Karabakh Armenians at the moment.
Emil, that's messaging too, isn't it? Saying to your population that this is where we're going to put our resource and do the rebuilding. Is that message reaching Karabakh?
Well, it's not. I haven't heard that actual message from Prime Minister of Armenia, and what we heard from the Chief of Staff of Karabakh President is that in the last at least 3-4 months, they have not had major funding coming in for reconstruction. They're actually construction for the refugees is currently, or IDPs in Karabakh is currently stalled because of lack of finance.
And what about the expectations of the Russians?
Now, the Russians are actually building a lot of different things there, primarily for themselves, their own military forces. They've already built housing for them and all the other infrastructure. They're continuing working on that. And apparently, as an aside, they're also building some houses for displaced Karabakh residents. But it's not clear what volume, if that's sufficient or not.
Okay, so if we go back to actual verbal messaging for the moment, with this new, very recent but substantial announcement by Azerbaijan's president about what were the words, Vicken, that he used? No atrocities.
Basically saying, I mean, this was new. I read it today. For the first time, I noticed that there's a kind of shift in his messaging, in his discourse, away from the past, away from the conflict, away from insisting on the destruction, on the refugees, on the IDPs, to something new. So I don't want to make it something big out of it, but we should observe it. Maybe it's a new approach, and we should see how deep it goes. Because there's also contradictory messaging as well coming out of Baku.
So that contradictory messaging is out of Baku, but it's not just out of Baku. Emil, what were you going to add?
I was going to say, governments always speak with in two ways. They speak with the actual speech, and they also speak with actions. And in addition to speech, we have had actions such as holding of the Armenian POWs and hostages, capturing new ones, shooting at the border, provocations at the border, interdicting traffic on the border. Until those actions are put to an end, we could say that there is an actual change in the government rhetoric. I agree that there's been a change of emphasis in speeches, but they tend to go from one end to another.
So what do we do in this environment where, on the one hand, the messaging is at best inconsistent and from both sides, and also not really substantial? Moving forward and building doesn't quite explain coexistence. It doesn't quite explain how you're going to actually live, Armenians living within the boundaries of another sovereign state, and yet somehow connected to the culture and the resources and the economy of Armenia, a different state. So there's this reality on the ground, but the words and the explanations that lead to reliance and trust that there is, in fact, a predictable future. That is still missing. The specifics are still missing. While commissions and officials are meeting over very specific things like borders, like transport corridors. So Vicken, where do we break into this? Where do we seek the messages that are going to put this post-conflict, well, post-war situation on firmer ground?
2 points to answer your question. First, I'm not sure whether the political leaders in charge in Baku and Yerevan, they realized the dramatic changes after the war. We are not in a similar situation as before the war. Armenia finds itself in a very different and very new geopolitical setting, which didn't exist before. First, there's Armenia itself, which today realizes that it's under much bigger Russian influence than before. And then there's a different reality, which is that of Karabakh Armenians, where we might see in the near future a very different political discourse and very different set of political choices emerging from them, because today they live in a very different reality. Now, coming to Baku, I don't know how much Azerbaijani policymakers realize that for having this victory of 2020, Azerbaijan has paid a huge price, and Azerbaijan has become a territory where different forces coexist today. Those different forces might be in harmony at the moment, but who knows what will happen in the relationship between Moscow and Ankara, or between Ankara and Tehran in 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. So before developing a new discourse, I don't know how much these people kind of realize the parameters of the new geopolitical game in the region. The second point is that I want to make and underline is that we cannot rely on states and on state officials and their choices. Those two set of institutions, Azerbaijani leadership and Armenian leadership, they had long 26 years to negotiate, and they monopolized the negotiations to find a solution to the Karabakh conflict. And eventually they failed in doing that. They reproduced a second war. So I think now people like us, journalists, academics, opinion makers, but also the public, the citizens of the two countries, they should also shoulder their part of responsibility to say it's also up to us to seek ways in having a solution to this conflict, in normalizing relations, and finding channels of dialogue so that we don't reproduce the same kind of polarization and the danger of war a third time.
Before we talk about your second point, which absolutely needs to be taken apart, I want to go back to your first point. Emil, did you want to add something? Because I want to ask about that dissonance on the ground.
Yeah, dissonance on the ground, but what Vicken mentioned, the different reality after the war increases players such as Turkey and Russia in that region. It seems almost the level of analysis and level of decision making has shifted now from Baku, Yerevan to Ankara, Moscow. So in a sense, all of these other elements of local societies trying to influence decision making become even less relevant when it comes to who will be actually taking decisions.
And so, in effect, what you're kind of both saying is we have two sets of players. We have Azerbaijan and Armenians who are really living in the moment. Azerbaijan in its euphoria, and Armenians in this seeming need to just get beyond this and move on. Yet the other two players, Russia and Turkey, are those who play the long game, because this isn't their immediate problem. This is part of their long game. And so 4 people are sitting around a table playing with 2 separate sets of rules. Yeah? Vicken, is that the reality?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's more complicated than that. We don't know the rules of the bigger game. We don't know based on what Ankara and Moscow play this game in the South Caucasus, but also in other regions. I mean, look at Russian-Turkish relations in the last 5 years. We have from long-term economic collaboration to nearly going to war in November 2015 and huge tensions up to summer 2016, and then collaboration, cooperation, antagonism, and all that together in Syria and Libya. Now, when we come to the South Caucasus, when we talk about Armenia, Karabakh, Azerbaijan, this region for Russia is even more sensitive than the game played in Syria and Libya. So basically, not only we have 2 sets of rules, but we don't know the rules anymore.
And the pieces on the table are different, if I'm going to continue with the game analogy, that Russia and Turkey have many more pieces to play because they also have all of these other games going. And in the case of Armenians and Azerbaijan, each is really just playing with the 2 pieces in hand, their side and the other side. So again, the lack of messaging from the leadership of the 2 main parties, the lack of acknowledgement of the role of, not just the role of these big powers, but the fact that this conflict is now a piece of those bigger conflicts, leads the populations, I think, and I don't know, Emil, if you agree with this reading, it leads the populations to expectations that are not realistic. You know, why isn't the Armenian government doing this? And why doesn't Azerbaijan just get to this? Well, in reality, there are other situations that they must consider and deal with.
Yeah, I think it looks to me like the society in Armenia, definitely, the focus is again on domestic contestation for power. In Azerbaijan, I think that will soon come as well, because yes, Aliyev has sort of affirmed his control through this war, but by inviting other players, by essentially diluting his absolute power in Azerbaijan, he has exposed himself to, I think, future domestic unrest as well. I mean, it's just an inevitable thing. You cannot have a regime in place for so many years and to be able to maintain the control that it has, considering both the economic challenges that Azerbaijan is facing now because of the oil industry is not as good as it used to be, and also because just the immense pressure that the public of Azerbaijan, the society or population, has been living under. With the government control over everything, every activity that you can imagine. So both societies, I think, will be turning inward in that sense, and this issue will probably sort of not going to be addressed in any reasonable way in any time soon.
Which takes us to Vicken's second point a little while ago, in that the processes should not be left up to the states and their leaders, and the public should have a greater hand in this. But Vicken, how do you do that in a country like Azerbaijan, where forever the peace lobby and the democracy lobby were at loggerheads with each other because there wasn't enough space for both of them? Now, whatever teeny bit of a peace lobby there is still right up against the democracy lobby.
Yes, I mean, that problem in Azerbaijan is well known, but in Armenia we have a similar problem. I mean, look at the debate in Armenia. It's just who's the traitor? No, seek the traitor. The whole debate didn't evolve much further than that, except within some islands where people are really asking the difficult questions. Why the failure? Why the defeat? Why did Armenian strategic thinking fail? Why the army didn't perform? Why the diplomacy didn't perform, and so on. So there are some people asking questions, but when we look at the dominant media in Armenia, they are not picking up this debate, and instead it's a very sterile accusation debate. So we have problems in Azerbaijan, but we also have problems in Armenia. Maybe the reasons are not similar, but the end result is quite similar. So to overcome that, I think all of us, we should take our responsibilities and have kind of self-critical regard about our work in these long 26 years. Where did we fail as individuals, and where did we fail as institutions? Institutions where we evolved, worked, and developed. And only after that we can answer and look forward to a different future.
In Armenia, I think the peculiar situation is that Armenia did go through a major change of governance in the last 2 years. So I think 2.5 now, almost 3 years. I guess it will be inevitable that the current government will be blamed for this failure rather than whatever happened before this government. The facts are speaking for themselves. There was relative stability for 20 plus years. This government came in and the situation crumbled. So, yes, there are obviously problems that preceded the current government, but that level of analysis will not happen. It will be blame Nicole, and obviously there are a lot to blame for.
So let's develop the messaging. The messaging that is needed both for the domestic audiences as well as for the international audience, because as absent as they have been, both because of structural limitations and also because of other distractions, nevertheless, the observers are still there, potential funds are still there, attitudes about engaging both of these republics within global structures is still important. So let's talk about the messaging. What is the messaging that the publics and then the leaders ought to be saying? What is the honest messaging that needs to be conveyed? Vicken, do you want to become prime minister or president for a few minutes?
No, I leave that to others. I will play my role. I think messaging is intimately related with policy choices. I mean, you can't separate one from the other. And for the moment, as we discussed earlier, it's not clear what direction Yerevan wants to take. It's also not clear what direction Baku wants to take. And once they decide, the messaging will come along. Now, what we need is, first of all, societal discussion. Let's limit ourselves within Armenia. Armenia should have a very radical, profound discussion about choices made in the past and real possible choices in the future. Not to continue in this kind of dreaming kind of situation where once again we want to become the Israel of the Caucasus or the Prussia of the Middle East. Armenia already in the pre-2020 years was spending 5% of its GDP on the military effort. So how much more do you want to spend to secure your well-being and security after the 2020 war? I think we should put all the real choices and their costs on the table and have a societal discussion about them.
Emil, do you want to play prime minister or president?
Well, actually, I was looking at my own remarks from 8-9 years ago that I was at the conference in Stepanakert and spoke about what I thought was a misguided policy at the time, both in terms of freezing the conflict, not lobbying Yerevan for recognition of Karabakh, and not bringing Karabakh much more into the international agenda. So basically, it was at the time actually. Karabakh didn't even have a foreign minister. It was a big break between the firing one and hiring another. And another thing was that there was no effort whatsoever to try to reach out to Azerbaijani public. Just as today, there isn't any. And today it's going to be so much more difficult because, if in the past you had some experience, like Serge Sargsyan, extended Robert Kocharan, had experience working with Azerbaijanis, living with Azerbaijanis, and fighting with Azerbaijanis, but didn't have that distance from Azerbaijan that say Nikol Pashinyan and the new generation of Armenian politicians have. It's just going to be even more difficult to do it now. So what I see is again more muddling through, just on much worse terms than they were before. And it seems to me that whatever the advice is going to be, the answer is going to be the same. the answer is going to be a continued domestic fight over who's in power. And that's what we're seeing today, what we're seeing in the last weeks, and we'll see in the next number of months.
Vicken, I said at the beginning of this conversation that you have been engaged in many public discussions since the war, different formats, different interlocutors, different questions. But what is your takeaway? Because it kind of comes back to this issue of being able to talk both to yourselves and to the other guy. What has been your takeaway about the nature of the conversations with international observers and with Azerbaijanis? Is it a different sort of conversation, or is it more of the old school, second track, NGO dialogue, confidence building measures? Has anything changed at that level?
Yes, things have changed. Now I have a feeling that we are in front of a new period, both in Armenia, within the Armenian public, larger than Armenia, in Armenia, but also in the diaspora, as well as in Azerbaijan and within the Azerbaijan diaspora. After the war, I have a sense that people are asking questions, which didn't exist before. So now we have to build on this and try to not only articulate answers, but also listen to others, listen to different voices, and try to encourage the development of different voices. Because for more than 2 decades, we had only monologues coming out of Yerevan and Baku, and next to these monologues, there was no place for any other experimentation with ideas, with possibilities, with imagination, with dreaming, whatever it is.
Why? Why wasn't there?
Different reasons. In Azerbaijan, because with Ilham Aliyev coming to power, there was censorship. All these voices that existed in Azerbaijan, they were censored. Many of them, they left Azerbaijan and they were in exile. In Armenia, it was very different. In Armenia, we didn't have this kind of repression, but there was such a huge popular pressure where any questioning, any alternative voice had no space. My experience with Armenia was that whatever I said, I was indifferent. People were indifferent. They didn't engage in the conversation. So eventually you end up being tired and you stop talking. Now we are not there anymore. Now there's a big interest, but we should also learn from the mistakes of the past, because in the past we did have this kind of NGOs with foreign funding, basically foreign funding, where they tried to keep a kind of artificial dialogue. Now, I'm for dialogue and I'm for NGOs, but we should be clear that the conditionality of the dialogue should be free. Foreign funders should understand that by putting too many conditions and by thinking of dialogue as a project and by limiting the space of this dialogue, they suffocate it.
Limiting the space?
Now we need...
Limiting the space, what does
yes,
that mean?
Because when you make dialogue a project, then you have so many conditions coming with it. Eventually, you precondition how the dialogue will be, how the discourse to evolve, what to say and what not to say, when to stop talking. And what we need today is a real deep and long space for dialogue and for reflection and to think about past failures and about future possibilities. And for that, whoever is the donor of such projects, they should understand that by putting too many limits, and this is how NGO projects evolve in the last 15, 20 years, is that it becomes so much kind of conditioned that eventually you stop thinking and you just produce events so that you write reports and go on living.
But what else to expect if you have organizations or governments that are behind this project are not really vested that much in stability and peace and development of that area? It's just a side project for most governments that don't really think of the future of that part of the world much at all, because that's not part of their part of the world. And what we've had in the Caucasus in the last 30 years is just an absence of a quote unquote an owner. Nobody owns that place as a whole place, right? If in the Soviet period there was a clear ownership by the Soviet government, and they told everybody how to behave and not to use nationalist rhetoric and all of that, we don't have that kind of hegemon in that world today, and they have national projects that obviously run in parallel and in contradiction to each other. So unless you have a new hegemon that demands and dictates and delivers blows and goods when necessary, you won't have that. It's just you cannot expect the NGO track to supplant sort of the organic educational hate systems that exist in those countries.
Alternative.
Two things to answer to Emil, if I may. First, there won't be a hegemon. Don't dream about it. The Soviet Union is gone. Moreover, the South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, they are encircled by three major powers. But these three powers have enormous internal difficulties. So don't count on regional stability coming from these three external powers. Neither Russia, nor Iran, nor Turkey is going to be the same from now to in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So if you have problems, don't count on major powers to intervene and solve it for you. Second, the discourse is not going to come and sorry?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but isn't that what just happened with Turkey's involvement?
Yeah, absolutely.
But at the end of the day, Turkey met its requirement, and now this next requirement for security and peace isn't Turkey's requirement.
True. Yeah, it's just they are looking for different types of outcomes.
This is as good a place to end this part of this conversation for this episode, because at the end of the day, when it comes to the absence of that other kind of messaging, whether it's from the state leaders or from the absent hegemons, present hegemons, but absent messaging, then it really comes back to the two societies to develop the dialogues that will result in the messages that will influence policy. That is the traditional track of civic engagement. And even though this is a post-war situation, that process remains the same. Yeah, that's our conclusion.
I vote for that.
Well, good. Emil, cynically, hopelessly, but that's...
I mean, it's hard to look optimistically at this situation. I'm not sure if we are in fact not around the corner from some kind of hegemony being reasserted in the Caucasus. I'm not sure about that. I think we are somewhere in the 90s, but I'm not sure in the terms of reference point, most recent historical reference point, but I'm not sure if it's going to go towards the 80s or if it's going to go back towards the 90s and the early 2000s.
Well, we'll still take a break here, and in future episodes, obviously, we're going to talk about each of those powers, Iran, Turkey, Russia, and from their perspective, their expectations of this post-war, after-war, before-peace situation. Thank you, Dr. Vicken Cheterian in Geneva. I suspect we'll be talking with you again. And thank you, Emil Sanamyan, again. See you soon for another episode of After War, Before Peace. And thank you all for continuing to follow the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies as we continue to explore the various facets of the challenges facing both societies, Armenian and Azerbaijani, as well as the region, as the world looks at conflicting powers that are trying to head from war to security and peace. You can catch the other episodes in English as well as in Armenian on YouTube and on all of the podcast channels. We do hope that you share these and that the conversation grows even as it continues to be complex and complicated and difficult. Thank you for following us at the USC Institute of Armenian Studies.